End quote. Let an oppose. Be reasonable, Mr. Miller. $75,000 is more than enough for a man in your delicate situation. End quote. That's what Victoria Thorne said to me, her voice dripping with that fake, polished sympathy that makes your skin crawl as she slid a check across my old oak table like she was doing me some huge favor. I just sat there, looking at that piece of paper, then back out my window at the 130 luxury cabin she'd built on my family's lake while I was laying in a hospital bed in Germany. And I realized right then that she didn't and oppose. TC a neighbor or a man with rights. She saw a, end quote, broken, end quote, veteran she could buy for pennies. My name is Elias Miller, and for 22 years, I was a combat engineer in the Army, a, end quote, sapper, end quote, who built bridges under fire and cleared minefields in places God forgot. But after losing my left leg to a roadside bomb in Kandahar, all I wanted was to come home to the quiet of Blackwood Lake in the Idaho Panhandle. This land has been the Miller name since 1915, 40 acres of timber and the most beautiful spring-fed water you've ever seen, a place where the air usually smells like pine and damp earth. But when I finally got home in late 2025 after 6 months of surgeries and rehab, the air smelled like diesel exhaust and fresh asphalt. Victoria Thorne, the CEO of Thorne Legacy Estates, had spent my entire recovery period turning my sanctuary into a playground for the ultra-rich, building an entire, end quote, eco-resort, end quote, right up to my property line, and as I quickly discovered, tapping directly into the massive underground aquifer that feeds my private well. My first morning home, I tried to take a shower, and all I got was a pathetic, rusty trickle that smelled like chlorine and sunscreen. And when I checked my power bill, it had jumped from $60 to nearly $1,000 because my well pump was screaming 24 hours a day to keep her 130 cabins pressurized. See, Victoria is the kind of person who's never heard the word, end quote, no, end quote, in her entire life. She drives a jet black G-Wagon that's never seen a gravel road and wears designer outdoor gear that costs more than my annual pension. And she honestly thought that because I was limping on a titanium prosthetic and living in a cabin built by my grandfather, I was just a, end quote, problem, end quote, to be managed. She stood there in my living room, smelling like expensive perfume and entitlement, telling me that the resort was, end quote, good for the community, end quote, and that my water rights were, end quote, archaic, end quote. But she made a huge mistake in her calculations because she forgot that as a sapper, my entire job was to understand how things are built and, more importantly, how to take them apart if they're standing in the way of the mission. After she left my house that day, I didn't oppose. To get angry, I got quiet, which my daughter Sarah says is when people should actually start worrying about me. So I grabbed my keys and my cane and drove down to the county recorder in Oppo's office in a beat-up Ford that's seen better days. I spent 3 days buried in dusty ledger books and microfiche, smelling that old paper smell that stays in your lungs. And what I found was better than any weapon I ever carried in the service. My great-grandfather wasn't an oppose. Just a farmer. He was a man who understood that in the West, water is more valuable than gold, and he had secured, end quote, senior absolute water rights, end quote, back in 1922, which means every drop of water in that basin belongs to the Miller property first, and anyone else is just borrowing it with permission. I found the old easements Victoria's lawyers had tried to bury, and it turned out they had expired back in the 90s when the previous ranch owner passed away, meaning Victoria had built a $12 million empire on a foundation of absolute theft. She figured I was too broke or too tired to look, and for a few weeks she was right, but then she started getting aggressive, and that's when the, end quote, combat, end quote, part of my brain clicked back into gear. She sent these private security guys in polo shirts to park at the end of my driveway, end quote, monitoring, end quote, who came and went. And one afternoon while I was out on my dock trying to teach Sarah how to cast a fly rod, one of Victoria's jet skiing guests actually buzzed us, splashing water all over my daughter and laughing like it was a joke. I looked up and saw Victoria standing on the balcony of her massive central lodge, holding a glass of wine and watching us like we were animals in a zoo. And I knew right then that the $75,000 was an oppose, TA bribe. It was a test of my spine. I called up an old friend from my unit, a guy named Marcus who now works as a high-level hydrological engineer, and we spent a weekend in my pump house, looking at the schematics my grandfather had left behind. My grandfather was a bit of a survivalist, and he'd built the main water manifold for the entire valley right under my property, a massive junction of steel pipes and heavy-duty gate valves that controlled the flow from the primary spring to every secondary line Victoria had illegally tapped into. Marcus looked at me and said, and quote, "Elias, you realize you have the Oppos. Often Oppos. Switch for her entire world right here. Don and Oppos. To you?" End quote. And I just nodded, feeling that cold, familiar focus settle over me. Because Victoria wanted to play a game of power, but she didn't in Oppos. T realized I was the one holding the deck. The tension really broke about a week before the 4th of July, which is the biggest weekend for her resort, with every cabin booked for $2,000 a night and some high-profile investors coming in to see the place. I was out checking my mail when Victoria's G-Wagon pulled up, kicking gravel onto my boots, and she stepped out looking like she was ready for a fight. She told me that if I didn't end Oppos, T signed the permanent easement by Friday, she was going to sue me for, end quote, interference with commerce, end quote, and have the county declare my property a public nuisance because of the, end quote, unsafe, end quote, state of my old barn. She leaned in close, that expensive perfume clashing with the smell of the pine trees, and whispered, end quote, "Nobody cares about a broken-down soldier, Elias. They care about progress, and you're just a speed bump," end quote. That was the moment she lost. I didn't in Oppos, T say a word, I just watched her drive away, and then I went back to my cabin and started making phone calls, because if I was just a, end quote, speed bump, end quote, I was going to be the one that blew out her tires and sent her whole life into the ditch. I contacted the State Water Board, the Environmental Protection Agency, and a local investigative journalist named Maya, who had been looking for a reason to dig into Thorn Legacy Estates for months. We spent the next 72 hours documenting everything. The dropping water table, the illegal pipe connections, and the fact that the resort's high-capacity sewage system was leaking trace amounts of runoff into the lower creek because it was an end Oppos, T-rated for 130 cabins. But the real, end quote, sapper, end quote, move was the physical one. See, as a combat engineer, you learn that you don an Oppos. T always need to destroy the bridge. You just have to make it unusable at the exact moment the enemy needs it most. I spent Thursday night in my pump house with a heavy-duty wrench and a legal injunction from the state court that Maya had helped me fast-track through a judge who happened to be a Marine vet. The injunction stated that until a full audit of water rights was completed, all, end quote, non-essential commercial draws, end quote, from the Miller Aquifer had to cease immediately to protect the primary residential supply. Friday morning rolled around, the sun coming up hot and golden over the mountains, and the resort was buzzing like a beehive, hundreds of wealthy families arriving with their boats and their expectations, and Victoria was right there in the middle of it all, playing the perfect hostess. At exactly 10 a.m., the hottest part of the morning, I walked into my pump house, gripped the massive iron wheel of the main gate valve, and turned it until I heard the heavy, end quote, thunk, end quote, of the seat locking into place. In an instant, the pressure to the resort dropped to zero. Now, if you've never been in a luxury cabin with no water, let me tell you it stops being, end quote, luxury, end quote. Real fast, the toilets don in Oppos. T flush, the showers don in Oppos. T work, the ice machines stop humming, and that massive infinity pool Victoria was so proud it started looking like a stagnant pond in the midday heat. By noon, there were dozens of people in the lobby screaming about their $5,000 deposits, and Victoria was frantically calling plumbers, but the plumbers couldn't, end Oppos, T do a thing because the, end quote, problem, end quote, wasn't an Oppos, T a broken pipe. It was a legal wall. I sat on my porch in a lawn chair, Sarah by my side with a cold lemonade, and watched the chaos unfold through my binoculars. About an hour later, the G-Wagon came flying up my driveway, nearly hitting my mailbox, and Victoria jumped out, her designer outfit rumpled, and her face a shade of red I didn't in Oppos. T no humans could turn. She started screaming before she even hit the porch, calling me every name in the book, telling me she was going to have me arrested, that I was a domestic terrorist, end quote, bitter loser, end quote, who couldn't in Oppos, T stand to see someone else succeed. I didn't in Oppos. T move an inch. I just waited for her to run out of breath, And then I pointed to the sheriff's cruiser and the two black SUVs from the state water board that were pulling up right behind her. Sheriff Miller, no relation, but a good man, stepped out and handed her a stack of papers that basically told her that her entire resort was being, in quote, red tagged, in quote, for immediate evacuation due to a lack of functional sanitation and multiple environmental violations. Victoria looked at the papers, then at the sheriff, then at me, and for the first time, I saw the mask slip and I saw the fear underneath the entitlement. She tried one last time to pull the, in quote, "Do you know who my father is," in quote, card, but the state official just shook his head and told her that her father's name was named Apos, T, on the 1922 water deed. The next 48 hours were pure, unadulterated karma. I watched a parade of luxury cars and SUVs streaming away from Blackwood Lake, families looking miserable and Victoria standing in the middle of her empty, in quote, empire, in quote, realizing that the, end quote, speed bump, in quote, had just ended her career. The legal battle that followed was long and messy, but when the dust settled, Thorne Legacy Estates was forced into bankruptcy, and, as part of the settlement, they had to pay for the full restoration of the creek and the decommissioning of over half the cabins to bring the land back into environmental compliance. I didn't in Oppos, take her $75,000, but I did end up with a massive settlement that I used to turn my property into a retreat for other wounded vets, a place where they can come and fish and breathe air that doesn't in Oppos. Smell like diesel. And the best part is we have the best water pressure in the state. Victoria? Last I heard, she's working for a property management firm in the city, far away from any lakes, and I think about her sometimes when I'm sitting on my dock at sunset, watching the eagles fish in a lake that's finally quiet again. It's funny how people think that having a disability or living a simple life makes you weak, but if my time in the Sappers taught me anything, it's that the quietest guy in a room is usually the one who knows exactly where the foundation is buried. And if you try to build your house on someone else's land, Don and Oppos, be surprised when the water stops flowing. But it makes me wonder, was I too harsh? Some people in town say I ruined the local economy because those tourists brought in money, while others say I'm a hero for standing up to corporate greed that was killing our natural resources. Victoria thinks I'm a villain who used a technicality to destroy her life and Oppos' work, but I think I just reminded her that respect, ISN, and Oppos' something you can buy with a check. It's something you earn by realizing you aren't and Oppos' the only person on the map. So what do you think? Did I cross the line by shutting it all down on the biggest weekend of the year? Or was it the only way to make a person like Victoria actually listen? Drop a comment below and let me know if you would have taken the money and moved on, or if you would have turned the valve just like I did. I really want to hear your take on this, because in a world that's constantly building over the past, sometimes the only thing left to do is stand your ground.